In the mountains of Panama, two young women vanished without explanation, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that defied every attempt at rational analysis. What investigators discovered in the weeks that followed would challenge the very foundations of how disappearances are understood and investigated. But before we proceed, subscribe for more chilling revelations. It was April 1st, 2014, just after 10 in the morning in the mountain town of Boquete, Panama. The air hung thick with mist as two Dutch students, 21-year-old Kris Kremers and 22-year-old Lisanne Froon, prepared for what should have been a simple day hike. The women had arrived in this remote corner of Kyriki province weeks earlier, volunteering at a local children's center while exploring the dense cloud forests that blanket the continental divide. Boquete sits nestled in a valley where the Caldera River cuts through volcanic soil, surrounded by peaks that disappear into perpetual cloud cover. The town serves as a gateway to the Baru Volcano National Park, where hiking trails wind through terrain so dense that experienced guides have been known to lose their bearings within minutes of leaving marked paths. According to official reports, the women set out that morning to hike the Pianista Trail, a well-documented path that begins behind the town and climbs steadily into the cloud forest. Local authorities described it as a moderate hike, suitable for tourists with basic hiking experience. The trail follows an old pipeline route for approximately 5 kilometers before reaching a small meadow known locally as the Mirador, offering views of the Boquete Valley below. What happened next would become the subject of one of the most extensively documented, yet inexplicable, disappearance cases in modern history. The women failed to return that evening. Their host family, growing concerned as darkness fell, contacted local authorities. Search teams deployed at first light, following the Pianista Trail and expanding their search radius with each passing day. The terrain proved treacherous, with steep ravines carved by centuries of rainfall and vegetation so thick that visibility dropped to mere meters in many areas. For 10 days, the search yielded nothing. Then, on April 11th, something unprecedented occurred. Local, indigenous guides reported finding what appeared to be a campsite deep in the forest, approximately 8 kilometers beyond the normal end of the Pianista Trail. The site contained no human remains, no clothing, no equipment that could be definitively linked to the missing women. But the guides described something that defied explanation. The vegetation around the campsite had been arranged in patterns that served no apparent survival purpose. Branches had been woven into geometric shapes and suspended from trees at precise intervals. The ground showed signs of systematic disturbance, as if something had been repeatedly dragged in circular patterns around the perimeter. Most disturbing were the trees themselves. Several large specimens showed scarring approximately 2 meters from the ground, parallel scratches that appeared fresh but followed no pattern consistent with animal activity. The marks were too high for ground-dwelling predators, too regular for accidental damage, and too extensive for any. Search teams documented the site but found no direct evidence linking it to the missing women. The case appeared to stall until June 14th, when a local woman discovered a backpack along the banks of the backpack belonged to Lisanne Froon. Inside, investigators found both women's phones, a camera, and various personal items. The condition of these objects would prove more puzzling than their discovery. Forensic analysis revealed that both phones had been turned on and off repeatedly in the days following the disappearance. The pattern of activation suggested systematic attempts to find cellular service, with power conservation measures that indicated sophisticated knowledge of the device's capabilities. Most calls were made to emergency services, but the signal strength in the remote area prevented connection. The phones showed activity for 11 days after the disappearance, with the final activation occurring on April 11th. But the pattern of use raised questions that investigators could not answer. Why had the women not used the phone's flashlight function, which would have been invaluable for nighttime navigation? Why were there no attempts to send text messages, which require less signal strength than voice calls? The camera contained over 90 photos taken during the hike, providing a timeline of the women's journey. The images showed them following the Pianista Trail, reaching the Mirador, and then continuing beyond the normal turnaround point. The final daylight photos, then came a gap of 8 days. The next photos were taken in complete darkness, beginning in the early morning hours of April 8th. These images would prove to be the most disturbing evidence in the entire case. 97 photographs were taken over a period of 3 hours, all in darkness using the camera's flash. The images showed fragments of the forest floor, rock formations, and what appeared to be attempts to mark a trail or signal for help. Several photos captured pieces of clothing and personal items, but the women themselves appeared in none of the nighttime images. Most unsettling were the photos that seemed to serve no practical purpose. Multiple images showed the same rock formation from slightly different angles, as if documenting something that was not visible in the darkness. Other photos captured empty forest scenes with no apparent subject matter. Taken at one photograph showed what forensic experts described as a stick construction, branches arranged in a deliberate pattern that resembled a shelter or signal marker. The arrangement was photographed from multiple angles, suggesting it held significance for whoever was operating the camera. The final photograph in the sequence showed a clear view of the back of Lisanne's head, her blonde hair visible in the camera's flash. The image was taken at approximately 4 in the morning on April 8th, and no photos were taken afterward despite the camera's memory card having remaining capacity. Weeks later, local residents began finding human remains along various tributaries of the Culebra River. The bones were scattered across a wide area, some discovered more than 20 kilometers from the backpack slope. Forensic examination revealed that the remains belonged to both women, but the condition and distribution of the bones raised new questions. The bones showed no signs of trauma consistent with a fall or animal attack. They had been cleaned completely of soft tissue, despite the relatively short time since the disappearance. Some bones showed signs of bleaching that typically requires months or years of exposure, yet they had been missing for only 10 weeks. Most puzzling was the discovery pattern. The bones were found in locations that required crossing multiple river systems and traversing terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate without specialized equipment. Some remains were discovered in areas that search teams had thoroughly examined weeks earlier, suggesting they had been placed there after the initial searches concluded. The official investigation concluded that the women had become lost after hiking beyond the marked trail, but this explanation failed to account for numerous anomalies in the evidence. The systematic phone usage, the nighttime photography, the condition of the remains, and the impossible distribution pattern all suggested something far more complex than a simple hiking accident. Local indigenous communities offered their own theories, speaking of areas in the cloud forest where people had vanished for generations. They described zones where compasses fail, where familiar landmarks shift position, and where the very geometry of the landscape seems to change, depending on the observer's perspective. These accounts, dismissed by official investigators as folklore, contain details that aligned disturbingly with the evidence. The indigenous guides spoke of the arranging, a phenomenon where lost travelers compulsively create patterns and structures in the forest as if responding to some external influence that compels systematic behavior. They described how those affected by the phenomenon would document their actions obsessively, taking photographs or making marks even when such activities served no survival purpose. The compulsion to create patterns and record evidence supposedly intensified over time, leading to increasingly elaborate constructions that defied rational explanation. What do you think compelled two experienced travelers to venture so far beyond a marked trail and engage in such systematic documentation of their final days? Subscribe to explore more cases where the evidence challenges everything we think we know about human disappearances.